what we are doing with child rearing today and what we've been doing for a couple of generations is very, very different from, I think, anything that has ever been done before. And it has a serious downside. Parents try and create these perfect childhoods without disappointment, without pain, without difficulty, and try and almost curate childhood, to give them the outcome that they think that they should have. What we have done is we really cut down on the experiences that kids have so that they're all happy. But, and then when you get into the adult world or you have to go through something difficult, you don't have those resources to draw on. You can't sort of think back, I thought this was really bad, but, I got over that. I can do this. You just don't have that anymore.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Beyond Gender. Today, we have a fascinating guest, as we often do, Nancy McDermott, who is the author of The Problem with Parenting: How Raising Children is Changing Across America. Welcome to the show, Nancy. Maybe you could just start off by letting us know what inspired this book of yours.
Right. Well, the immediate inspiration was when I had kids. I was an older mother, and I was living in Park Slope, Brooklyn, which is the joke, which wasn't really a joke. I mean, you couldn't throw a rock without hitting a journalist or, somebody who'd won an Oscar, or, it's just very kind of type A driven people. And so I found myself with little children. And it was just a weird culture. I can remember, taking my son to the park for the first time, and this woman, just trying to make small talk, even though we didn't have anything in common. We just had these kids, and she was telling me about, all of her son's nap times and how she dressed him for comfort, not for looks, but for comfort. And it was just very kind of overwrought, and it wasn't just that particular woman. It was just very kind of intense. I can remember talking, because I'm part of a mom's group that I, got onto through Park Slope Parents, which is a listserv that I ended up having or helping to run. And, just like the attention to every little detail, like I say, good job, not good girl, because I don't want her to be a good girl. I don't want her to be a people pleaser. And so, just that kind of like very sort of intense, kind of micro attention to kids. So I was fascinated by that, but also, I came from a background where, my father was in the military. And so we moved around a lot when I was a child. And what that meant was that, first of all, my family was very important to me, and I paid a lot of attention to it because it was this kind of constant in a sort of life of change. But also, I was exposed to all these different sorts of families, and so I became kind of very attuned to family culture in a way that I don't know that everyone is. So I was just fascinated by it, and I would talk to people about it, and their eyes would glaze over, and so eventually I decided I should write a book about it, which is what I did.
Could I ask you, Nancy? Now, of course, I know you well because you are a key member of the GenSpec team. Nancy runs the GenSpec Substack, and did you get much opposition when you wrote the book? Was there any pushback, or how was it received?
Well, it published in the middle of the pandemic, so I didn't get to have a book tour. I didn't get to do like an online book launch, and it was well received by my, I guess you could call them my peers. I started writing things and being associated with the Center for Parenting Culture Studies at the University of Kent at Canterbury in the UK. And they really liked it because it takes things in a more historical direction, and they're all sociologists. So I think it kind of created some context. So they liked it. I liked it. But I'm afraid the world is yet to discover my book.
Would you just tell, because they're about to discover it now, ding, ding. Could you give people just a kind of a synopsis of what you wanted to get across? It's a great book. I have to say, I really recommend it. Really, really powerful book and really important. I think me and you, Nancy, land in a very similar place around parenting. But could you tell people what they'll get out of the book and where you were going with it, what you wanted to get across, and who were you writing to, really?
Well, I was very much writing for parents because I think the thing that kind of moved me the most, at least in the beginning, was just how much parents were suffering and beating themselves up and second guessing themselves about, every little thing that they did with their kids. And at the same time, we, particularly in the US, we have kind of a culture of parent blaming. And so I wanted to reassure parents, but I also wanted to give them an idea of what is going on, and that it's it's not it's not just them. It's not what they're doing. There's been a massive cultural shift that started in the 70s, which was just like a complete break with the past. And what we are doing with child rearing today and what we've been doing for a couple of generations is very, very different from, I think, anything that has ever been done before, and has a serious downside. And it's not their fault, really.
Is that change, could it be described as moving from an institution for raising children into a vehicle for self-fulfillment? That's one of the notes I wrote down, that kind of change in parenting.
Absolutely. Bingo. You got it. But but this is the societal shift that has been happening for a long time, which is that we have been moving toward a society where the self, or the authentic self, it has become the highest good. I mean, previous societies, God was the highest good, or various other things. And really, since the end of the 19th century, we've been moving in that direction. And the interesting thing is that the family always kind of served as a bulwark against that, because, like you say, the family is an institution, and so it just kind of almost automatically reproduce these very sort of functional ways of being with other people. I mean, I would say that the bourgeois family, which is how I would locate that cultural achievement, really was a cultural achievement. It really changed society. It changed adulthood. It changed childhood. And But what happens in the 70s is that we finally just reach a tipping point where it can no longer survive as an institution anymore. It's too unstable. And so the focus for child rearing shifts from being part of a greater whole, so it's bigger than the sum of its parts, to very much being focused on the parent-child relationship. And there are all sorts of implications for that.
What are some of those implications? I think I read something about the transfer of cultural values that gets disrupted, which I think I can see playing itself out in the world at large, if we're thinking of the same types of things.
That's right. Well, I guess just to back up just a minute, I mean, one of the things that I learned about the family in the course of researching the book is something that I think Christopher Lasch says really well in his book, Behave in a Heartless World, is he says that the family socializes children. It inculcates them into the values of society at the level of the personality. And he calls that a very delicate process. And it's something that we do without knowing that we're doing it. Now, what has happened is that because we have lost the connection to that institution, what's happening is a couple of things. One is that uh, the kind of value that we are transmitting to kids is about being their authentic self, but without a legacy or a past to draw on. They have to go out and totally self-invent themselves. Um, and for parents, it's also parents have to reinvent parenting. They have to reinvent child rearing. Every generations of parents do it. It's, like right now, it's gentle parenting. When my kids were little, it was attachment parenting. Very much the same thing, I think. Just different wrapping. And then the other thing is it's just very intense. When it's all about the relationship between the parent and the child. It's very difficult, I think, sometimes for parents and children to have that separation and to have a break from one another. So there's this term in sociology, they call it intensive parenting, and that it really is intense. And part of the reason it's intense is that it has to do with the breakup of the family, because it's like when you have a family unit that can break up, marriages don't always last forever. The one relationship that you have that is permanent is between the parent and the child. And so that makes it very, very intense for parents and also for children. And it's really hard for kids, I think, to be under that sort of scrutiny.
I wonder on that, could we lean in a little bit on gentle parenting and attachment parenting? Like I said, you're a key member of the GenSpec USA team, and you and I have spoken a lot about parents in the context of trans, if you follow me,
Mm.
and the challenges the parents of trans identified kids have. Have you any thoughts around that? Especially around the attachment parenting and the gentle parenting or other, because I know you've been working very deeply within GenSpec.
Well, I do, and something I recently, of course, everybody else probably knows about this, but I took a break doing jazz back. But there is this thing which is referred to as matrolescence. And what matrolescence is uh, it's this period when children are small, when they're babies, when as a mother, or I think arguably as a father too, um, you're learning a lot because you have this new person in your life and you're getting to know them. And part of getting to know them, I think, as a parent, is getting to understand that they're no longer a part of you, that you love them and you know them, but they're a different person. And making that separation. And I think that what I see just generally, and I think maybe more so in the case of parents who have these kids who are in distress, is like a real inability of parents to separate themselves, and also to be able uh, to to separate their emotions. So this isn't specifically have to do with trans, but um, I can remember we had a rule at our school that you couldn't invite anybody to a birthday party unless you invited every kid in the class, because the parents were so afraid of the disappointment that this child would feel if they weren't invited to the birthday party. And it wasn't really about the child. It's like these parents like, oh, I have not had the invitation to the birthday party. And they're just so invested and they're feeling it. And I think that, you have to, uh, you have to be able to say, is this about them or is this about me? And I think that is not happening, um, as well for all parents, but I think particularly in the uh, in the lives of, kids who are trans-identified. I could say more.
Yeah. I thought Brett was going to come in, but I do have a thought. If you, I thought the same as you. And, I wrote my book, Cottonwool Kids, in 2015. And in very many ways, Cottonwool Kids was almost describing what ended up being the trans kid that I was working with, 5 years later. And I had no concept around trans in 2015. I wasn't working in it, wasn't following any of it. And it was very much this overwrought parenting and intense parenting. However, having had kids myself and gone through this whole societal kind of intensity, I I I kind of I wonder, is enough time given to how much pressure, and I think you agree with me, Nancy, but I want to lead us into it. How much pressure is put on parents to make sure that their kids are happy and to make sure that their kids aren't left out? And so, I remember once, for example, I was having a coffee with my friend and she was telling me her little boy had a fight in school. And we were just meeting up after school. No big deal. And he was fine. He was playing over in the corner with my kids. It was all fine. Everything was fine. Except my friend was getting this onslaught of texts from other mothers saying, what are you going to do? Are you going to complain to school? Are you going to go to the police? What are you going to do? Is he all right? Are you going to bring him to the doctor? And I just saw in real time a mother just kind of feeling hassled into upping her concern. And I just felt that happened again and again for me and for every other parent, that we didn't go in like basket cases. We ended up like basket cases because the world made us worry constantly. I just add to that story. When my little girl was about 1, I can remember it, and I was pregnant. So maybe she was 1 and a bit. And I'd put the child into the car, right? And the key that I'd locked myself out of the car. She was in the car, fast asleep, happy, well fed, warm, cozy in her thing, fast asleep. And the childminder said, break the window. And I said, oh, I don't think I need to break the window. I think I can just ring AA. Do you have that automobile association? I don't have to break the window. No, break it. She's in there. And I was like, but no, I can just ring up. I'm thinking, get me, you know what I mean? And she was there like this crazy woman telling me to basically get a hammer and break the window of the car to save my child, who was fast asleep and happy in the car. So I rang AA, ignoring the childminder, who basically thought I was like Myra Hindley. And I said, my baby's fast asleep in the car and I've been knocked out. And they said, we always prioritise mothers and daughters. We'll be out in 10 minutes. And they came out in 10 minutes and opened the car, and there was no big deal. But my God, I got a taste of the pressure that parents are hassled into. So I think we lose our game. I think parents come in with kind of great ideas and love and benevolence and competence almost, and we lose. It's like you're trying to play tennis and everybody's hassling you to play it in a different way. We lose our natural skills because they're battered out of us.
I think that's really true. And especially like in, when you, I think I said this to you at one point, I think it's really hard when you're a new parent because, instincts don't just appear. You have to develop them and you have to get to know your child. And in my book, I liken it to learning to dance with a new partner. And you sort of, you watch them and they watch you, and you're trying to anticipate what they want, and they're trying to, relate to you. And eventually you know each other so well that you can kind of anticipate and you can kind of function in harmony. But what happens now is well, first of all, somebody painted feet on the floor that we're supposed to be following. And I would call that Dr. Spock did that. And then now we have all of these experts on the sidelines saying, move to your right, move to your left. And just, there's so much noise and there's so much information. And it does get worse depending on where you live. So for example, like my little boy, who's now like a man, but one of my sons was really, really into fire hydrants and exit signs. And so, like we would stop and we would look at every fire hydrant, and, for Halloween, you dressed up like an exit sign. And people were saying, oh, weird. Do you think you should have him evaluated? And I said,
Fire
so it,
hydrant syndrome. It's up and coming.
yeah. And I'm thinking, oh, he's identifying with like fire hydrants and not bunny rabbits. And like my mom took him out and they went for a nature walk and he finds a fire hydrant. He's like, oh, it's a fire hydrant. And she's like, but I, the sleepless nights I had thinking, oh my God, have I done the right thing? I don't want him to be labeled. I don't want him to get him on this merry-go-round of trying to specify what he is. That's just, he's a kid who likes exit signs and fire hydrants. Um, and, uh, and, uh, and he's lovely and he's fine. And it's really interesting because occasionally, like some old friend from Brooklyn will come and they'll say, I really admire you that you didn't get your son evaluated. So, but
Interesting.
there's that pressure there and you can just beat the hell out of yourself over it.
So much of what you're saying makes me think about our cultural relationship with distress. Like there's something, just a culture-wide shift in how we understand distress. And the new understanding is it must be eliminated at all costs. Whereas even this, just a couple decades ago in my generation, when we were being raised, that was just part of the deal. And it was almost sort of fun. And we had another guest on, JD Hattigan, where we talked about latchkey kids and the difference between latchkey kids who go out and play and their parents don't even know where they're at until 8 at night. And that there was something dangerous and valuable, really valuable about kids just having to deal with distress, figure it out,
Well, it's funny you mention that because I watched that and one of the things I think about is attachment theory. And how I was saying to Stella at one point that pendulum swinger that I am, at one point I was like, no attachment is it's not true, which is I've mellowed a bit. Attachment is real. But I think that what has happened is that attachment has been kind of fetishized and it's become very kind of deterministic. So the idea is that anything that happens to you as a child, anything that disrupts attachment, anything that's traumatic, anything that's disappointment, any pain is something that, you'll carry around for the rest of your life. And it's like, it's going to shape you and it's potentially really terrible. So I think parents see their job as trying to minimize those disappointments and, and the skinned knees and the broken bones and all the things which used to make up a childhood, and which are actually really important because we've kind of flipped things on their heads because it used to be understood that the stakes are really low in childhood. And so, someone is disappointed about not getting invited to the birthday party. And the adults used to be like, they'll get over it. And you would, and often you wouldn't even remember it. But we now have this idea that, this is a burden that you will carry. And so parents try and create these perfect childhoods without disappointment, without pain, without difficulty, and try and almost curate childhood, to give them the outcome that they think that they should have. And I actually don't think that's how psychology works. I don't think that's how human development works. I think that, childhood is like a treasure chest. And it's like you have all of these experiences, good and bad and different, and you carry those around with you that you can take them out, you can draw lessons from, you can interpret them and reinterpret them, and they help you in life. And I think that what we have done is we really, really cut down on the experiences that kids have so that they're all happy, but and then when you get into the adult world, or you have to go through something difficult, you don't have those resources to draw on. You can't sort of think back, oh, I thought this was really bad, but I got over that. I can do this. You just don't have that anymore. I think that's a real problem.
This all sounds also related to me, to technology and life online, because life online, life with your phone, relating to your phone and your computer kind of prevents you from having a lot of the real life experiences, and the it's you not only are the kids not out and playing, they're not even living in a real world in some sense. It's a flattened version of the world that they're seeing on the screen. And sometimes I get this sense when I talk to parents and kids that each one is isolated in their own room in the house, and that
Yeah.
they're not actually interacting. They're just cohabitating, but not relating to one another. And I don't know if that's just a function of how I'm hearing about the relationship, or if this is something that's actually happened. I think I threw like 5 questions into that. Sorry, just pick the
Well,
one you want.
well, I mean, I think the way I look at technology is I think it kind of amplifies things that are already there. And I think that what has happened to the family, and you can see this if you read people who study the family, they kind of they present it almost as if you have this household of people, and they all have their individual needs, and they live together in this house, and sometimes the needs can't be met within the family, and I think the the problem um, is is that it- technology kind of gives you a place to go with that sort of supposition. So instead of having to resolve a conflict with your child, or instead of having to deal with your sister, or instead of having to do things in the real world, you have this kind of sugar coated place that you can go, that has this appearance of reality, but is not reality. But it's difficult because it's like when kids have been raised like that and you don't have a lot of real experiences become really frightening and intimidating. Um, and it's just easier to have this illusion that you have real friends online, and that, that's, you can be whoever you want to online. And it's difficult to kind of convey that if kids haven't had those sorts of experiences for themselves offline, I mean.
And you have to actively kind of fight against the online temptations. Like, my kids are 15 and 17, and we were really very good until a couple of years ago, all of us. And it just slid in. They got that little bit older, and they, of course, wanted their time in their own rooms. And therefore, technology arrived into the house much more pronounced. You know what I mean? Once they did the normal teenage thing, which is going off into their own room, technology slowly but surely took us all over. It was a slow creep, very like putting on weight. You don't really see it coming on, and then you realize, jeez, we're on our devices all the time, and it's become completely habitual. And once it's habitual in a household, it takes a hell of a lot of effort, like taking off that weight. It takes a real commitment to get back to what you once had, if you follow me, to get those bad habits out. I'm surprised because I'm all over it. I talk about it and I'm, writing about it. And yet it slid into our family, like so many families. COVID, the kids hitting their teens, the combination just obliterated us device-wise.
Well, and also, I mean, mom's living online, because
Mm.
I have a lot of friends, and they're overseas, or they're in a different city, or I'm doing work for someone who's not right there. And so, you know, they're seeing me do it. And at first, like, they used to play on my iPad, and I have my youngest son was really into Thomas the Tank Engine. And he started taking his Thomas toys and doing these little videos about the Thomas toys. And he'd say, "Hello, well, it's me, and I have, D90 199," and he would narrate, these little, kind of introductions to this very rare Thomas here. And I discovered this is a whole genre online. I don't know how he found it. All of his friends found it, and it was cute. And I have all of these little videos of him doing it. But, I certainly didn't. I don't know how he started doing it. I mean, as it happens in his case, it's kind of led to a good place. But I just remember being shocked because I had no idea, how this happened. And I remember this terrible moment where, like, my older son, he said, "Mom, when I grow up and I'm a dad, I'm gonna set up an Instagram account for my baby." and and we found it hard, so we would do things like we made them turn in their phones at 9 o'clock. And they didn't get phones until they were quite a bit older than the other kids. But it's difficult because everything is organized around the idea that you will have a phone now. So, like, my kids had finished sports practice and maybe it ended earlier. So I would come on time. There would be the coach, waiting. And of course, all the other kids knew because they had phones and they could call. And so then it's like, oh, well, she doesn't have the phone. So, it's really hard. And then also during the pandemic, I think for a lot of parents, it was like, oh my God, my kids don't, they don't have their friends. At least, if they're online with their friends, they can see their friends. And like you say, it's not the same. And also, I have a friend, Jenny Bristow, at the Center for Parenting and Culture Studies, and she and her daughter during the pandemic decided that they would do some sociological research. So they did surveys with her friends to find out, what it was they most missed about school. And it was really interesting because it was things like just the people you might see who you didn't know that well, but, maybe you passed them in the hall or maybe you sat next to them in a class. And it's just like Jenny's kind of conclusion of it, which just runs through my mind all the time, is kids need other kids. And online is not the same.
Not even close. I want to change directions here just a little bit. There's something that I'm witnessing a lot, and I want your thoughts on it. A loss of parental rights. Like, I live in California, and in California, a 6-year-old can show up and, 6-year-old boy can say, "I'm a girl," and then all the teachers will go along with that and keep it secret from the parents. And it just, I could go on and on about other changes, but it's just like their parents don't even have the legal rights over their kids in the same way they used to, in a way that seems horrifying to me.
Well, and that is just absolutely reprehensible.
Yeah.
But it is part of a bigger problem, which is the loss of parental authority. Which is kind of goes back to one of the reasons why I wrote my book, is that I found that parents were just being blamed and it just seemed very, very unfair to me. But the kind of cumulative result of that is that on the one hand, you have all of this pressure to be this intense parent and to be there and to deal with all your kids' needs. But at the same time, when you do that, there is a cost for that. It can become destructive. So then you're blamed for it. So you're in this kind of catch-22 where you can't do anything right. And it's a real problem because children need their parents to have authority over them. They need to understand that their parents will protect them. They need to understand that 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 parents know better than them, and that they should, and that they should probably do what they say. I mean, I think what's happened is that uh, as a society, we've undermined parental authority, and so you have these people who are uh, putting laws like that in place, and the assumption is that that parents don't know what they're doing. And the difficult thing, I think, for parents is that we have internalized a lot of this. We're second guessing ourselves all the time. So even people who think that there's something wrong with laws like that, there's always this like, oh yeah, but some parents are bad, and of course, we know that there are parents who are not good, but the vast majority of parents absolutely need to have authority over their kids and absolutely need to be able to protect them because they know them better than anyone else and they care more than anyone else. And it has a really bad effect on all of us because it infantilizes all adults. And it's just a terrible thing to do to parents and to kids. Um, I when they first started to talk about children's rights in the 70s, really what it was about the state's rights to come in and to determine what you did with your kids. And I remember there was some high profile cases of kids, emancipating from their kids, or not from their kids, from their parents. And doing it in court, it would be on the news and stuff. And you're thinking, this child is too young to emancipate themselves. You have some adults who are doing this for whatever reason. So I agree with you. I think it's a terrible problem. And I also think it's interesting because I think in general we have a problem with authority. And so I think that's one reason why parents have trouble being able to uh, oh no, sorry, being able to uh, do what their kids need for them to do because sorry, I had a phone call there. Because anything that is authoritative is seen as authoritarianism, which is different. And so, sometimes, you just need to say, uh, you're going to bed now, and you don't need to have a discussion. And the kid says, why? And you said, because I said so. And that's what authority is. But there are people who would say, no, 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 you need to explain it. And that, I think, is like one of the impetuses for gentle parenting, is this idea that you can't wield authority. You have to always convince kids and kind of be on their level.
But limits are oppressive.
No, they're
That
not.
is, of
No,
course.
They're
they're
liberate.
Yeah.
absolutely
Yeah,
they're
but that is
absolutely
the message.
necessary. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's there in academia. Like any time that any rule has been normalized, it's kind of seen as some sort of oppressive social convention that just needs to be dismantled. And the implicit message is always we'll be free. We'll be free of all the oppression. Except that a lot of the social norms that have developed are they're functional, they have a reason, and they in some way make us aware of just natural human limitations.
Well, they're right. That's right. If you don't have limits, you don't have boundaries, then nothing really makes sense because you have
Right.
nothing that
Mm-hmm.
you can kind of gauge where you are against that. But it's interesting. Just one of the things that kind of came up, just I don't know how it came up in Gen Spec, but Stella's mom is actually older than my mother was, so by 5 years. So I was born like on the cusp of the last year of the baby boom. And it's interesting because it struck me that a lot of what I did with my kids was trying to recreate what my mother had done, and the things that I thought were good about it. Whereas a lot of parents that I meet, what they're trying to do is to do something different than what their parents did. And it's almost like the kind of generational transfer of knowledge about what human beings are like, what children are like, what families are like. That's kind of become verboten. And it means that parents today don't have those norms to draw on. It's like if they did it 15 years ago, it's totally irrelevant now to date, and we can't relate to it. And it's a real problem, I think.
It just strikes me as so insulting of prior generations, as if they didn't figure out anything that they could leave to us to help us out. It's like, no, 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 we know better because we're us, apparently, that's just enough. It's really twisted.
Well, it's like the grandparenting classes. I mean, I meet grandparents or to be, and I would like to be a grandparent someday, but they're all like, oh, they won't let me be with the baby until I take the grandparenting class. And they mean someone like, oh, and I had to do it because so much has changed. And we had no idea. And I was just, oh, for goodness
Oh,
sake. Yeah, you did, you knew what you're doing. You still know what you're doing. You've developed this lifetime of instincts about, people you love. And the grandparenting class is just throwing it out the window.
oh, that's so depressing. I noticed in your book, you did a kind of a very interesting kind of almost a timeline between the 1970s up to now, if you follow me, and how it's changed. You kind of make the very, I think, valuable point that everything changed in this time period. Do you think it's consumerism? Why would parenting have changed? What is your I believe it has changed, and I do think parents are generally reacting to their parents in a negative way nowadays. You know what I mean? I'm not going to
Mhm.
do what my parents. I think that's a very good point. Why did you think, was it the two parents working family in the 80s? What was it? What do you think? Why?
Well, I think part of it was the massive increase in divorce, um,
Yeah.
that kind of happened in the 70s. And, it's important to understand that this was something that was building for a while. So it wasn't like having more liberal divorce made it happen, but it was like, you'd had all of this pressure building up about, the importance of the self and who am I, and I've got this one life to live, and and how am I going to find meaning? Because people found they weren't able to feel satisfied with these social roles that they had played before. Um, which is a very interesting survey in the 70s, where like one year they say I'm a doctor, and like the next year they say I'm a doctor and I have a rock band. And it's like, you don't have these sort of, things that you can feel self-respect about. And that's actually what the feminine mystique is about, I think, is about this kind of pressure, that has been building for self-fulfillment amongst parents. Anyway, the the divorce laws are liberalized, and you have this thing that they call the divorce revolution. And I think at the time, um, and to a certain extent now, it became very therapeutic for adults. It was like, I'm going to have this divorce, I'm going to start over, and my kids will just be happy because I'm happy. Um, but if you go back and you look at, like, if you talk to people, or you look at some of the longitudinal research that was done, interviews with kids, they were desperate. They were angry. They were hurt, um, and they felt abandoned, and terrible things happened. I think I'm not going to remember his name, but if you read the book Townie, which is by Andre Du Bois III, um, I think I've got his name wrong, but he talks about how his parents got a divorce. His mom had to go out to work. His brother and his brother's teacher are having an affair. and the house. Nobody's there. His mom is always working. They're getting beaten up on the way to and from school. And so it's kind of extreme, but there was this just kind of like adults disappeared from kids' worlds and they were supposed to just get on with it. And I think that the lessons that they drew from that seem to be that that's definitely what they don't want. And also just that any negative thing that happens could just spell the end of everything. And so there's an interview in some of this research with this woman. She's like, I want to give my kids the childhood I didn't have, and I want to be there for them. My mother was always work. I want to be there. And that kind of, I think there's an overcorrection. So you get like you want to protect your kids from disappointment. You always want to be there. You always want to be, which becomes hovering. So I think that was kind of an unrecognized trauma that we went through as a society. And in fact, when I was working on my book, I started asking people who were kids in that era, did your parents divorce? And what was that like for you? And I had more than one person just break down in tears because nobody had ever asked them what it was like for them. So we went through that, and I think some of this is an overcorrection for that. And I feel like we have this kind of, legacy that we're dealing with, and it becomes, it's like Chinese whispers, or, which I don't know, is that not correct now? But you start to circle the inner critic. But so you say something in one end of the line and you whisper it, and at the other end you get something different. And I think that what's happened is that we had those original intentions, and then those have kind of been codified as parenting advice, and then that's been internalized by people. And so it's very difficult because these beliefs about childhood and about what parents can do are deeply internalized into people. And to say what I'm saying sounds just crazy to some people.
Because I'm thinking about the idea of like generational continuity, and I have a sense that like people of my generation, I'm a Gen Xer, could still in somehow relate to prior generations, and we had a similar frame of reference. There was some sort of shared values, even though it was a different generation. But I'm getting the sense that there are current generations coming up that are just completely alienated from prior generations. There's no continuity. There's no bridge anymore. But I don't know to what degree that's just my machinations. Does that make any sense to you, Nancy?
It does. There's a very interesting survey that was done with at the Wharton School of Business in Philadelphia, and every year they would ask a series of the same questions about, what did what were your ambitions? Did you want to start a family? That kind of thing. And what's really interesting is that a few years ago, for the first time, the majority of young women said they didn't want a family. And the reasons that they gave were, on the one hand, they said, well, I can do so much more good. I'll join I'll work for an NGO, then I can help lots of children, and I won't be in this selfish institution, which is just about your biological children. So there was that sort of sentiment to it. But then there was also a few people said, well, I saw what it was like for my parents, and it was awful. They were unhappy all the time. And they were just, trying to do these, all this stuff for us, and they just weren't happy. And I think that it's probably true because, when raising kids is so intense, you aren't always happy.
Yeah.
There are periods where you're not. And so, why would you do that to yourself, especially if, you have one life to live, you want to live your best life, and, why would you do that? So.
Oh, that seems tragic. It's funny. I carried out a parents' survey, and I didn't ask this question. I'm raging I didn't. But this was of parents of trans-identified kids, and I wish I'd asked them, like, did you have a happy childhood? Because I've often wondered, are a lot of these parents incredibly loving and engaged? Might they have had difficult childhoods themselves and then, reacting to thinking I'm going to give my kid, or, there's always exceptions to the rule before everybody emails me. Of course there are. But it's something I've often wondered about, that these are really committed parents who are determined to give their children a happy childhood. And I would consider myself among them. You know what I mean? I wasn't a happy kid, and I was determined to give my kids a happy childhood. And it's kind of heads you lose, tails you lose, isn't it? Like, you know what I mean? Because you're trying too hard. Do you know what I mean? It's tragedy. Like, being a parent is a tragedy, because really, ultimately, the job is for them to grow up and not need you. So it's an inbuilt tragedy from start to end, And I know it's got a lot of beauty in it, and there's a lot of complexity, and it's a kind of phenomenal experience. But it does feel to me that parenting seems to be harder now, pressurized, stressy, emotionally demanding than ever before.
Well, that's right. And it's because I think it's because it's gone from just being a part of life to being an activity. Like, whenever they put an ing on something, like adulting, you know that nobody understands what being an adult is anymore, because you've had to make it into a series of things that you do. And that's what happened with parenting. And in my book, I really tried to pay tribute to Nora Ephron, who, as far as I know, is the first person who picked up on this. And, she wrote this wonderful essay, which I, probably quote from too much, but it was really good. And she made this really lovely point about raising kids, is that she said, when you're a parent, what it's like is it's just being around a lot. It's not, maybe, teaching them which is the salad fork and which is the other one, and to just be around. And not to get into their business unless they want you to get into their business. But I think what's happened is that, their business has become our business. And so, like, there's one of the films which was done about kids who got caught up in trans, is about this lovely woman and her daughter. And her daughter, I think she has these interests, and her mom is like right on them. It's like, oh, you like music? We will find the finest lessons for you, and you will be able to pursue this. And, it's going to become this lifelong love. And, it's so seductive to think that that's how life works. But in childhood, you try all sorts of different things. And when your parents are like trying to make your dreams come true, sometimes it's really hard and you want to do something else and you just want to drop it. And so the daughter, she just talks about how she basically had a breakdown because, she was in this competitive college. She had, done all of these amazing things. Her parents were so proud. They were so supportive, and it was just too much. And, if you're not just around and you're involved, you're not giving kids the space they need to grow up.
Just occurred to me that we're using gender neutral terms when we're saying parenting, parenting, parenting. We're not really specifically talking about being a mother or being a father. But do you have thoughts about, there is a difference there. And for me, it feels like there's a real absence of fathering and any sense of the importance of fathering. This is specifically something that a man does.
Well, I think that's really true. And it's really interesting because I was actually like 2 years after my book came out, I got to do a talk about it. It was, pandemic, but this man stood up in the back of the room and he, was talking about being a father. And, he was talking about, he had this kind of list of things that fathers do, which is okay as far as it goes. But I think that we've I think think what being a good mother and being a good father is about is being adaptable and learning to do what is necessary um uh in the circumstances. So like one of the things that has happened here is that you have people who never get married because they say, well, the father of my children, he's not a good breadwinner. He likes to play video games. I clean the house. And there's a real, there is a real thing going on there um, where men stay immature for longer for some reason. But I think that if you have this kind of open-ended, I am part of something that is bigger than myself. I have this family I need to protect, and I need to do what is necessary to make them thrive. Then it doesn't become like a job description. It becomes like a kind of a living thing that you do, and it takes its meaning from the context that you're in. And I think fathers are incredibly important, especially for boys. Um, which when I was, years ago, I said, it doesn't matter. But having boys, I think it really does matter. And particularly, there comes a point where like fathers and sons are kind of butting heads, and that needs to happen. And there's another thing that happens with fathers and daughters. So yeah, I think we've really devalued fatherhood.
Yeah. You don't even see the word fathering. You see mothering. You don't see the word. You don't hear the word fathering, like, you know what I mean, as a word. Well, I certainly don't. There's another kind of point you kind of raised around the family that made me think about it, insofar as, in the family has become this very small little self-contained unit of, for example, the traditional family, mother, father, and children. And then when it breaks, it's so fragile because there isn't the intergenerational, there isn't the extended family. So when it breaks, it's seismic because it was so small and so kind of enmeshed and dependent on itself. And I was saying to you before we started recording, in Ireland, they wrote the Constitution in Ireland about 100 years ago, and it was always considered very old-fashioned because there was a hell of a lot of emphasis on the family in our Constitution in Ireland. But actually, it's written in the Irish language, and it uses the word Tailloch, and Tailloch doesn't actually mean family. It can be translated as family, but it actually means the household. And in Ireland, especially, there would have been a lot of, let's say, mother-in-law. The granny would have lived with you, and you know what I mean. Grandad would come over, and the auntie or the uncle would often live with you. And it's a kind of a nice concept, and I'd love for a culture, I would love us to move beyond that kind of intensive parents and children family, because I think it's too fragile. I think it's too intensive. And I'd love if there was more cousins and aunties and grannies and grandas and all that kind of coming in. But I don't see how it, much as I'd love it to be, I don't see how it can come back. We've lost it, and I don't know if it's retrievable.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, I think about this all the time, and I think part of it is just that you almost need a movement, where people choose to, kind of re-examine this tradition that we had of family and to revive it. And I know that there are people out there. There is more talk of extended families, and and of course grandparents. Of course, part of that can also be intensive parenting, as the parents never want to let go. So they want to, but I think that there comes a certain point where it doesn't matter why you do something, the cumulative effect is a positive one. Um, but I think part of it is this idea of commitment. Because I think one of the problems that we have is that families the peg that we hang a family on now is emotion. And so emotion is a really fragile thing to have an institution hanging on. It needs to hang on something sturdier. Like that's that's so interesting about the idea of the household, is that it's not about people's feelings. It's about this commitment that you have to one another and something that you're part of. And so I mean, one of the things I was thinking about is like my granddad grew up on a ranch, and he was the youngest. And it used to floor me because all of his siblings and, anyone I ever met, they'd all say, well, Lester was the favorite. And you would never say, I have a favorite now because it's like, we must all be equal and we must, no one, but they were, because, if we have a favorite, then, someone will go off, the other child will go off and they'll feel bad. But they could do that because they were together for thick and thin and they were a family. And so it didn't
Wow.
matter that Lester was the favorite, because, they were all part of this thing. And, and it's just like the kind of, I don't know, maybe kind of low level fear that we have about, our relationships within the family and, what are the consequences, if they go wrong. Um,
You say low level fear. I would say high level terror. Is what we're living on. But come up towards the end. Is there anything that you would any kind of podcasts or books or films you'd recommend?
okay. I love, there's a quartet of books by Lois Lowry, called
Oh,
The Giver Quartet. Um, and, I have read this thing like, I don't know, so many times. And I think that if you want to understand what has happened to the family, and how you might recover living in a different way, that's a really interesting thing to read, which is just, it's almost eerie because like what she's done is she's done what artists do, which is that she's kind of picked up on all of these things around her and she's created this story. So the story of The Giver is about this place called the Community. And the community, they have families, but they also have no history. And the giver is the only person who knows history. So they're a society with no past. And the more times you read it, the more you start to see parallels in our society. So there's no past. And they're very afraid of strong emotions. So like when the kids kind of come of age and start to hit puberty and a sexual awakening or whatever, they start taking mood suppressants to keep their mood even. There's a kind of panel of experts that watches them from when they're kids and
no
helps
way.
them to sort of narrow down what they might do. And it's absolutely fascinating. So that's, everybody knows that because that's like, that's something that kids read in school here. But if you go through the whole quartet, you get to the end where they're trying to kind of live in a different society. And there's it's called Sun, but in a lot of ways it's about motherhood. And it's about because they have the birth mothers in the birthing center who have the kids, but they don't get to see the kids because the kids are assigned to the ideal parents. Um,
Shit.
and uh, it's just it's just a lovely thought experiment. And so people are tired of me giving them the Giver Quartet, saying you must read the Giver Quartet.
I must
So
read
all
it.
of you out there, go and get the Giver Quartet, and don't just stop with the first book. Read all of them, because I think that's
Well,
a very,
I
it's
would
like
say
a modern fairy tale.
I would say read Nancy's book first,
Yeah.
and then you can go on to the
Mm.
Giver
Yes, my
Quartet.
publisher will thank you.
Strange how the giver sounds so dystopian and yet so immediately real. It's like it's what's happening
Yeah.
already.
It is what's happening,
Yeah.
but there is hope. There's hope. So
Mm. Wow, this has been a fun one.
Thank you
I've
very much,
really,
Nancy.
thank you. I wanted to do this for so long. Yeah.
Yeah, I
So
wanted to have you on forever, and then just oh my god, it's
yeah,
when you've got somebody really beside you, and you think, oh yeah, that's the person you don't get on, but anyway, we got it in the end. So I'm delighted.
Mm.
Yes,
yeah,
you've so much to
yeah,
say, and it's
yeah.
so relevant to what's going on for parents these days. Thanks a million.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.